The Ridgepoint Police Department didn't need to hide their corruption. They wore it like a badge. They ruled through intimidation, buried complaints, and made sure no one dared to challenge them. For years, their power went unchecked, until they made the mistake of arresting Elijah Cole. They accused him of using a counterfeit bill, without even bothering to check it. They beat him, humiliated him, threw him in a cell, convinced he was just another man they could crush without consequence. But they didn't realize the truth. Elijah Cole wasn't just another man. He was a former Special Forces operative with the training and determination to take down men who thought they were untouchable. The sun hung high over Ridgepoint, pressing down with an unforgiving heat that made the familiar streets seem foreign. Elijah walked along the cracked sidewalk, the weight of the past few days settling into his bones like an ache he couldn't shake. Each step carried memories he wished he could erase, memories of a gas station, a cashier's nervous gaze, and sirens blaring in the distance. He had fought in war zones, hunted the worst kind of criminals, and yet here he was, walking through his own hometown, feeling like an intruder in his own life. The gas station at the corner stood just as he remembered, its peeling paint and flickering neon sign a stark reminder of simpler times before everything had crumbled beneath an unrelenting truth. Elijah entered the station, greeted by the cool rush of air conditioning mixed with a familiar sense of dust and stale coffee. The cashier, a teenager glued to his phone, barely acknowledged Elijah's presence. Grabbing a bottle of water and chewing gum, he approached the counter, but something felt eerily off. As he placed the cash down, the cashier hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Elijah sensed the shift immediately. Staring down at the $20 bill, the kid's fingers lingered, twitching near a hidden alarm system. A surge of anxiety tightened Elijah's gut. They were watching. "It's real," he said steadily, refusing to let the tension pull him under. The kid's expression changed, eyes darting to the register's underbelly for a split second, and Elijah knew he had to keep his cool. Any sudden movement might trigger a disaster, but the kid's body language told him everything. "Have a good one," the cashier mumbled, sliding the change across the counter before looking down again, focused on anything but Elijah standing before him. Elijah stepped out of the gas station, the hot sun hitting him like a wave of discomfort as he tried to brush off the unease that settled in his chest. He wasn't thinking about what had just happened, not yet. Instead, he tried to focus on reaching home, but just a few blocks away, the familiar sound of sirens broke through his reverie, pulling him back to a reality he was desperately trying to escape. At first, he kept walking, stubbornness pushing his steps forward in defiance of the chaos behind him. Maybe they were responding to a different call. But then he heard them closer, felt the car rolling beside him, lights flashing, almost predatory in their approach. His heartbeat quickened. The first cruiser pulled ahead, blocking his path, the second one circling him like a hawk sizing up its prey. Elijah's mind raced with the likelihood of confrontation. Maybe if he stayed calm, they would move along. But the air around him thickened with tension, the palpable energy of intimidation and familiarity, twisting the day into something menacing. "Stop right there." Tate, one of the officers, barked, stepping out of the patrol car with an unsettling sense of authority. His broad shoulders filled the doorway as he approached Elijah, Riggins flanking him. "What's the problem?" Elijah said evenly, refusing to let fear creep into his voice. "Mind if we ask where you're coming from?" Tate's eyes flickered down to the bag in Elijah's hand. Elijah didn't answer right away. He could sense the expectation in the air, how they assumed control over every detail, every interaction simply because they wore badges. But he was not intimidated. He had faced real threats before, military assignments that made the consequences of disobedience clay. "The gas station," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I paid cash." Another silent glance passed between the officers, their expressions shifting like dark clouds about to unleash a storm. "Yeah. You sure about that?" Tate leaned closer, a predatory grin forming. "We got a tip about counterfeit bills. Let's see that cash." Elijah felt his gut twist. "You could check it," he retorted. "Doesn't matter." Before he could react, Tate lunged, grabbing Elijah's arm and yanking him forward. Instinct kicked in. He twisted away, forcing Tate to stumble slightly before Riggins stepped in, hands ready to enforce whatever narrative they wanted to create. "Stop resisting," Tate shouted, the venom seeping from his voice. "I'm not resisting." Elijah shot back, frustration boiling beneath the surface. The push-pull of their confrontation spun into a chaotic ballet of limbs and aggression, and as punches landed, adrenaline blurred the lines between right and wrong. He was being dragged back, again, but this time he wasn't going to be made into a victim without a fight. He wasn't just another man. He had taken down real threats, faced real danger, a once-in-a-lifetime mission coursing through his veins. His mind raced with strategies, and with each blow, he engaged not just to defend, but to claim power. Behind him, he could hear the hesitant murmurs of onlookers, people who knew the truth yet remained paralyzed by fear. For years, Elijah had lived with that fear, but it was time to silence it. As the chaos unfolded, he felt something shift within him, a promise of retribution igniting in the depths of his being. This wasn't just a fight, it was a beginning, a reckoning. In that instant, he chose his path. Soon, Ridgepoint would witness a different kind of justice, one not shaped by the whims of those who had abused their power, but forged through the strength of a man unwilling to be crushed. Elijah took a breath, steady and determined, preparing to expose the darkness that had long lurked beneath Ridgepoint's surface, and to remind them all why it was finally time to take a stand. The chaos unfolded, and amidst the punches thrown and the words spat in anger, Elijah felt something shift within him, a promise of retribution igniting in the depths of his being. This wasn't just a fight, it was a beginning, a reckoning. Soon, Ridgepoint would witness a different kind of justice, one not shaped by the whims of those who had abused their power, but forged through the strength of a man unwilling to be crushed. He could smell the sweat, the fear, and the adrenaline coursing through the alley like a thick fog, but it didn't paralyze him. It propelled him forward. Each grunt, every exchange blow was stitched into the fabric of a bigger narrative, one where his resilience began to shine like a beacon against the oppressive night. "Get off." Tate's voice cut through the darkness, followed by grunts and gasps. Riggins struggled to regain his footing, and for a moment it felt like time slowed, all that noise fading into the background as Elijah focused only on his opponents. The world around him dimmed, the screams and sirens blurring together until he was solely aware of the struggling bodies in front of him. With a fierce elbow nudging his opponent back, Elijah pivoted, his foot sweeping under Riggins's feet, sending him crashing to the ground. Tate lunged again, fist swinging wildly, but Elijah ducked low, bracing himself against the impending blows. The first punch glanced off the side of his head, the second landed cleanly against his ribs, a jolt of pain shooting through him. Yet he continued, not out of desperation, but out of a primal will to expose the truth simmering under Ridgepoint's surface. "What's wrong, Tate? You thought you'd intimidate me." Elijah jeered, the words spilling out alongside the discomfort. He could see the surprise flicker in Tate's eyes, a crack beginning to show in the facade of control. Just then, he heard the distant sound of sirens growing louder, the whine echoing through the alley as their presence instilled a fresh fear in the hearts of Tate and Riggins. In that moment of hesitation, he struck again. A sharp hook caught Tate off guard, the officer stumbling slightly as Elijah pressed forward, shifting his weight and reclaiming dominion over the confrontation. Yet, the cries of the approaching squad cars weren't a panacea to the violence that had spiraled out of control. In his mind, Elijah knew it was now or never. His chest heaved, the air thick with the heat of battle, and each breath ignited within him a furious resolve. Tate recovered, blood dribbling from the corner of his mouth. "You'd better watch what you're doing," he spat, desperation leaking through the bravado. "This isn't just a fight, it's more than that." "Oh, I know," Elijah retorted, a fire kindling in his eyes. "This is about power, yours over the people of Ridgepoint, and mine to expose the facade." He tightened his fists, readying himself for the final dance. And then it happened. A cacophony of voices broke out from the shadows surrounding them. The originally silent witnesses had come to life, emerging from the edges of the alley, phone cameras raised, capturing the moment as if the universe itself conspired to capture this reckoning. "Get him, Elijah," someone shouted. And that encouragement was enough. The boundaries of humiliation and fear shattered, replaced with something electric, empowering. Riggins, still down on the ground, crawled forward in a desperate attempt to regain control. "Call it off, man. He began, but the sirens had reached a crescendo, and the light from the cruisers painted the alley in hues of red and blue. Too late for that, Riggins, Elijah shot back, stepping over him, dominating their space. The headlights swept through the alley, illuminating the unfolding drama, and as he stepped back from the fray, the tension twisted into something palpable, a reckoning. The carnage, however, would not only be seen in the bruises on their faces, but also in the buried stories of countless others who had suffered at the hands of the Ridgepoint police. The officers now emerging from their cars were not just responding to a call, they were stepping into an unfolding earthquake of truth. Elijah's focus sharpened, driven by the undeniable urgency of the moment. This was the climax he had waited for, where those who had turned a blind eye would finally confront the consequences of their actions. As the officer in charge began shouting commands, Elijah felt the adrenaline surge within him, propelling him forward. "I want to file charges against these men," he declared, voice steady, slicing through the chaos. Tate and Riggins exchanged panicked glances, scrambling to reclaim their authority, but it was already too late. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and Elijah wouldn't let them turn back. The lead officer turned to Elijah, surprise etched across his face at the sight of the situation unfolding before him. "What's going on here?" he barked, yet his attention shifted quickly to Tate and Riggins, picking them apart with a discerning gaze. "Officer, they assaulted me." Elijah's voice rang clear, unwavering, as he pivoted towards the other officers arriving on the scene. "They've been abusing their power for years," he added, pointing at the wreckage they had wrought. The officer's brow furrowed as he processed Elijah's words alongside the testimony of witnesses rushing forward. The atmosphere in the alley was charged with collective indignation. A community that had long been silenced was now uniting. As the officers cuffed Tate and Riggins, their expressions steeled with anger and disbelief, Elijah held his ground. He had to show them all, the onlookers, the newly arriving officers, that this was not just an incident. It was part of a larger narrative where power was held accountable and the truth insisted upon itself, like an inevitable tide. "I'm not backing down," Elijah declared to them, his voice echoing down the alley's walls, a proclamation not just for his fight, but for the truths buried beneath the surface of Ridgepoint. At that moment, as Tate and Riggins were led away, the shadows that had loomed over the town began to dissipate, poised to reveal what had long been hidden. This was merely the beginning, but it was a beginning steeped in the promise of change, of accountability, of hope. Elijah would make sure of that. As long as he was standing, he would ensure that Ridgepoint wrote a new story, one no longer cloaked in darkness. With every step forward, he could feel it, his destiny interwoven with the town's, and the fires of reckoning beginning to combust into something unimaginable yet utterly necessary. As Tate and Riggins were led away, shadows that had loomed over the town began to dissipate, poised to reveal what had long been hidden. This was merely the beginning, but it was a beginning steeped in the promise of change, of accountability, of hope. Elijah would make sure of that. As long as he was standing, he would ensure that Ridgepoint wrote a new story, one no longer cloaked in darkness. With every step forward, he could feel his destiny interwoven with the town's, and the fires of reckoning beginning to combust into something unimaginable yet utterly necessary. The adrenaline still coursing through him ebbed slowly, replaced by a surge of clarity. He had stood his ground and had brought down two men who had reveled in power too long unchecked. Around him, the crowd gradually began to disperse, murmurs of conversation filling the air. Some were contemplating the confrontation in disbelief, others trading whispers of solidarity. The world outside that alley now felt different, as if reverberating with an unspoken sense of justice. "Mr. Cole," a voice broke through the hum of conversation, pulling him from his thoughts. It was the lead officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an expression that seemed to bear the weight of old wounds. "We need to have a serious discussion about what just transpired." Elijah nodded, the gravity of the situation beginning to settle into his chest. "I need to tell you everything," he said, meeting the officer's gaze with resolve. "This isn't just about an assault. It's about a systemic issue. You've only seen a fraction of what they've done." The officer nodded, gesturing for Elijah to step further down the alley and away from the onlookers who still whispered and pointed, curiosity sparked by the rare spectacle of police corruption unraveling before their eyes. Name's Miller, the officer said as they stood beneath the flickering light of a street lamp, casting elongated shadows on the pavement. You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest, you know. The department doesn't take kindly to challenges, especially from people they underestimated. Elijah crossed his arms, leaning against the cool brick wall. They've been pulling this kind of stuff for years. I was just their next target. Miller's brow furrowed. Why didn't you come forward earlier? Why wait until now? The question pierced through Elijah, reawakening memories he tried to bury. I thought I could handle it myself, he confessed. I was naive, thinking I could just walk away. But this isn't just about me. It's about a community that has suffered because of them. They take advantage of people's fear. I want to change that. Let's outline an approach, then, Miller replied, his tone shifting from skepticism to earnestness. But this isn't going to be easy. You'll need proof, and they'll fight back with everything they've got. I have witnesses, Elijah insisted. People who have seen or experienced their brutality firsthand. Miller nodded slowly, considering. Gather them. We'll need statements and evidence. It's time we put a spotlight on this. The weight of the moment engulfed Elijah, not just the burden of what was to come, but the glimmer of hope he could feel in the air. The idea that real change could be fought for, that he didn't have to face this alone, was invigorating. I won't let this go unnoticed, Elijah vowed, his voice steady. The embers of rebellion within him flared. The people need to know they have power, too. We all do. Miller nodded with a grave understanding. We'll need to be strategic. They have connections, and they'll use their influence to discredit you. We can't afford mistakes. Elijah straightened, fueled by a purpose greater than himself. Then we don't make mistakes. The two men shared a look, an unspoken alliance forged in that moment, a tacit understanding that they were about to engage in a battle far bigger than themselves. They discussed plans into the cool night, weary questions exchanged like currency, and with each idea laid out, the weight on Elijah's shoulders felt lighter. After what felt like hours of strategy and hope, the discussion finally began to wrap up. As Miller turned to leave, he paused, glancing back at Elijah with a newfound respect. Stay safe, Cole. If their history is anything to go by, they won't take your challenge lightly. Trust me, I can take care of myself, Elijah assured him with a fierce grin, feeling an inner fire burn bright in the face of the uncertainty ahead. As Miller walked away, Elijah lingered a moment longer, bolstered by a mix of resolve and anticipation. It was the cusp of something monumental, an ache in his heart replaced by the thrill of purpose. He could feel it, an awakening among the townspeople, a rippling tide of unrest against the oppression they had endured. He would be their voice, the catalyst for change. With renewed confidence, Elijah began to navigate back toward the main street, taking note of the people he passed. Many were awake now, shadows of the past that would no longer hide beneath the weight of silence. His heart raced as he envisioned gathering the testimonies, the first step that would hold Tate and Riggins accountable. Plans swirled in his mind, who he would speak to first, how they would rally others to come forward, and what future challenges might loom over them like dark clouds. Approaching his apartment, Elijah took a moment to breathe deeply, allowing the warm night air to fill his lungs. The city felt different beneath his feet as he finally stepped inside, more alive, more critical than it had in years. The echoes of the past tried to tempt him back, but now he could see the flicker of a brighter future pulsing at the edge of Ridgepont's horizon. With each passing day, he would work to illuminate that path, showing everyone that the hallowed streets of their town did not have to remain shackled to tyranny. Elijah would ignite the fire of justice, and he would not let it die. He would ensure that Ridgepont's story bloomed anew, carving a future where fear held no dominion, a future where the people truly reclaimed their strength together. Elijah took a moment to breathe deeply, allowing the warm night air to fill his lungs. The city felt different beneath his feet as he finally stepped inside, more alive, more critical than it had in years. The echoes of the past tried to tempt him back, but now he could see the flicker of a brighter future pulsing at the edge of Ridgepont's horizon. With a determined heart, he opened his laptop, illuminating the darkened room. He sat down, fingers poised over the keyboard, eager to start the plan that had taken root in his mind. He needed to draft an outline for the testimonies and evidence he would gather, each piece meticulously documented, each voice validated. It wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about an entire community rising united against the injustices they had long endured. First, he jotted down names of witnesses he could approach. He remembered Mrs. Delaney from the coffee shop, who had spoken to him about the history of police brutality in Ridgepoint with a mixture of sorrow and rage. There was Malik, his childhood friend who'd faced harassment from the very officers Elijah now sought to oppose, and Zoe, the journalist who had been investigating police misconduct for years but had faced numerous roadblocks. They would all be crucial to the cause. As he typed, the enormity of the upcoming task began to settle in. Organizing testimonies would require not just bravery from himself but courage from those who had witnessed the darkness, and it needed a solid foundation of trust. He thought about reaching out to community organizations, affinity spaces that provided support and safety. They could help amplify voices that had been silenced, creating a chorus that could no longer be ignored. Night waned into dawn, the soft light creeping through his window like a whisper of encouragement. Determination curled around him as he pressed on, creating a plan for a meeting at the community center that could serve as a rallying point for those willing to rise up. He envisioned the room filled with residents speaking out, spirits rekindled in the safety of each other's presence, a melding of stories that would stitch together a powerful tapestry of resistance. In the midst of his fervent preparations, a ping came from his phone, snapping him back into the present. It was a message from Zoe. "I heard about last night. Let's talk. We need to spread the truth." Elijah's heart raced. Finally, someone who could help shed light on the darker corners of their town and document the stories that needed to be told. He quickly replied, arranging to meet at their usual coffee shop, the very heart of the community. As that meeting loomed on the horizon, Elijah's confidence surged. He would share his vision, rally her journalism skills to create a platform for this fight, and together they would begin to ignite informational pathways where there had only been silence. Days turned into a whirlwind of activity. Elijah met with each person from his list, their stories spilling forth like unshed tears, the burdens of their past compelling them into the new light of solidarity. Mrs. Delaney spoke of instances where officers had harassed a son for simply walking home from school, and Malik had tearfully recounted nights when he had turned to his mother instead of the nearest precinct, knowing the doors of justice could turn into cages instead. Each story was unique, yet they all resonated with the same thread, a collective pain and longing for change. Elijah meticulously recorded their accounts and found strength in their vulnerability. He would draft a letter demanding accountability, a petition that would lay bare the history of abuse, and he would invite the community to come forward, to join hands against the forces that sought to tear them apart. Then came the day of the community meeting. The center buzzed with energy, the plates of food on tables barely untouched as residents gathered, hesitant but eager. Elijah stood before them, the nervous tremors in his hands reminding him of everything that had been at stake. Yet, when he caught a glance at Zoe in the back, her comforting nod instilled him with a fierce conviction. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady, compelling, lacing through the crowd like a thread sewing them together. "You all know me, but what you may not know is how closely our stories intertwine. We gather here not just as individuals but as a community to stand against the injustices that have held us hostage for far too long." As he shared his own experience, the chaos of the alleyway confrontation, the room hung onto his words. Every heart began to harmonize with the call for unity. Each story shared sparked whispers of agreement, growing louder, echoing through the community center like an unstoppable chorus. Slowly, faces turned from uncertainty to resolve, recognition igniting kindred spirits. By the meeting's close, Elijah felt the rhythmic pulse of hope alive in the room. They put pen to paper, signing the petitions Elijah had prepared, committing to a stand that signaled the beginning of their uprising against systemic oppression. The echoes of those signatures reverberated through his soul. They were not just slanted lines marked on a page, they were vestiges of a collective heart beating for change, engulfed in a fierce desire for justice. As they filed out, each individual carrying a flicker of determination, Elijah couldn't help but feel a rush of exhilaration. This was just the beginning. Standing on the precipice of what lay ahead, he felt the weight of the past shifting, the dawn ushering in a new chapter for Ridgepoint. With a shared vision, they would confront the darkness that had long plagued their town, united in purpose and resilience. Together, they were ready to craft a new narrative, one with the promise of accountability and the warm glow of hope lighting their way into the future. And as Elijah looked out over the faces illuminated by that hope, he understood that they were no longer shadows panicked by silence. Instead, they were a movement, a collective force ready to reclaim their town, ready to reshape their reality. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but with every single heartbeat, the community was unmistakably awakening. And as Elijah breathed in the crisp air, filled with the possibility of tomorrow, he was filled with unwavering conviction. This time, they would write their own story, and they would do so unapologetically.